So first of all, we're delighted to welcome you here on behalf of the Institute of Modern Languages Research. And today's event will be an opportunity to hear from a range of speakers about the new Transnational Modern Languages book series published by Liverpool University Press. I've shared my screen here just to the web page, which is where you'll be able to find out more about the book series. And in particular, I just wanted to highlight there are a series of blogs by the editors of each of the volumes with kind of introductions to the series and obviously links to the actual volumes themselves that have been published so far. I just want to start the event by thanking the editors for accepting the invitation to host this event at the IMLR. I was very keen that we should kind of be hosting this event and kind of looking at this series on behalf of the IMLR because it's obviously very much connected to our own role in developing and supporting new research agendas in modern languages, and in particular demonstrating the value and importance of modern languages research, which this series I think does very clearly. And the series also has strong connections with the IMLR staff, in particular the former director, Catherine Davis, who is also here. She is one of the editors of one of the volumes. And also I think the Institute itself was very much a base for many of the meetings and discussions in relation to the series. Obviously, the role of the Institute itself, as the name suggests, we're very much focused on research. But one thing I think is really important about the research is that about the volumes is that they demonstrate how what we know as a very active and innovative research culture in modern languages, which is demonstrated across a number of major research projects in the past few years, how can this actually be fed back into curriculum reform and innovation? And inarguably, I think this is a task which is vital for the disciplinary future of modern languages, and I think will very much be the focus of discussion today. Just before handing over to the series editors, I just want to go over a few of the more practical event details. So just firstly, the event format. So first we're going to hear from the series editors, and I'll introduce them shortly. And they will explain the rationale and the aims of the series, and also in particular focusing on the role of the central handbook. After the series editors have talked about the series more generally, this will be followed by a panel discussion chaired by Loridana Paletsi, and we have 4 great speakers who we will introduce later who have been asked to respond to the series and in particular explore how it can be applied in their own context of teaching and research. At the end of the event, we should have, we hope, at least 30 to 40 minutes at the end for a wider Q&A session. And in that session, we very much hope that you will pose your own questions to the series editors, to the panelists. And I should also just mention, we do have a number of the editors of the individual language volumes on this Zoom call. And they are also very happy to respond to questions about individual language volumes. So we have a number of the editors here present. And just to explain how we'll manage the Q&A, I'll be taking questions in via the chat function. So if you could please post your questions directly to me, Naomi Wells, at any point during the event, so during the presentations, and that way I can gather these together for the final discussion. When you send your question to me, it would be really helpful if you could mention who you want the question, who the question's directed at, or whether it's a general question for the editors or the panelists. And to make for a more interactive discussion, we are planning to take live questions, but it would be really helpful if you can let me know in the chat if you'd like to pose a live question and that you're happy to unmute yourself to ask a question. And that way I can gather together a list of names. And I should also just mention we are recording this event and we will be posting the recording to the IMLR's web pages after the event. So if you'd prefer not to be included in the recording, then just let me know and we can read your question out on your behalf. So I think that's all the practical questions, but obviously do feel free to ask me a question in the chat if there's anything else I've forgotten. But now what I'll do is I'll move on to introduce our first speakers, and that is the editors of the book series. So all of the editors led the Transnationalizing Modern Languages, AHRC Translating Cultures large grant, and it is out of this project that this book series arose. Charles Burdett was PI on the project and is Professor of Italian Studies at the University of Durham, and has researched and published in the area of Italian colonialism and the representation of Islam in Italian culture. And he's also one of the editors of the Transnational Italian Studies volume. Jenny Burns is Professor of Italian Studies at Warwick University, and her research and various publications focus on migration and post-colonial literature in Italian, and she is one of the editors of the Transnational Modern Languages Handbook. Derek Duncan, Professor of Italian Studies at St Andrews, is the second editor of the Handbook and is currently working on a Leverhulme project, and he researches at the intersection of sexuality and gender and race and ethnicity in modern Italian culture. And then lastly, we have Loridana Paletsi, Professor of Translation Studies at Cardiff, and she's second editor of the Transnational Italian Studies volume and co-editor of the Translation Journal, and her current research focuses on translingual writing and self-translation. So Loridana is going to introduce and chair the panel later, and she will be introducing the panel speakers. But for now, I will hand over to Charles Burdett, who I think will begin by introducing the series. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for that, Naomi, and for the generosity of the IMLR, both for this event and, of course, throughout the development of the project. I just want to say quite briefly a few words about the genesis of the project and its intended purpose. As Naomi said, this is a project that originated from a large grant, Transnationalizing Modern Languages, Mobility, Identity and Translation in Modern Italian Cultures, and TML Global Challenges, both of which, of course, under the umbrella of the Translating Cultures theme, and our gratitude is due to the theme leader, Charles Forsdick, and to the team at the AHRC. At the heart of the project was the question whether one could prepare a publishing project that concentrates or has a very clear focus on the intellectual rationale of modern languages as a mode of cultural and linguistic analysis. And this is at a time when, as we know, modern languages is going through a number of pressures, but it's also a time of considerable excitement in the way that we are considering, as a community, different and interacting ways forward. So that's how it originated, well over 5 years ago, in fact. But I want to stress from the beginning that this is a very collective enterprise. It involves a large group of editors and, of course, a much, much larger group of contributors from different parts of the world, all of whom are engaged in related projects. And the project itself and where it started has been in touch with the British Academy, the IMLR, the University Council for Modern Languages, and of course also with the Open World Research Initiative and its many projects. So we see this as a coming together and a contribution to very many streams within the broader disciplinary field of modern languages. What we were hoping for from the text, or the idea of developing a textual resource, was that it would become a point of reference and also a resource among many. That would indicate the range of modern languages, their objects of study, their methodologies, their applications, and that it would be something that would be evolving quite rapidly over time. In some ways, we were inspired by the model of the cultural studies volumes that came out in the 1990s, and which certainly had an appreciable effect upon the way in which one might have considered what modern languages is as a disciplinary field. It is interesting to think that this publishing project itself has lasted at least 5 to 6 years, and hopefully it will continue for a long time. But it is 20 to 25 years ago since the volumes of the cultural studies series came out. So within that fairly general context, we were aiming as a collective group to do a certain range of things, which we continue to do, of course, in all of our individual and collective work. And one of them was to make sure that we move beyond any reliance or residual reliance on the nation state as an organizing principle. Now, I know, of course, that various sub-disciplines of modern languages move at different speeds in the way in which they move beyond any model of nationality and the potential of methodological nationalism. So another organizing principle was to make very explicit the importance of a very well-established body of theory, broadly speaking, related to the transnational, and of which one could mention almost any number of key texts, from Adjurai to Haya, to De Cesare and Vigny, to Leonet and Schumi Shi, Vignolo, Bertovec, and continuing onwards. The idea is that the study of any particular reality is very much explicitly attuned to practices of human mobility and exchange that occur on a global scale, and that the study of any particular site is the study of the continual exchange and development of practices, life ways, modes of understanding the material and non-material world that constitute human culture as a whole. So in some ways, we were concerned with the question of what is the object of study of modern languages, and to make sure that we move beyond any residual notion of territoriality and concentrate on movement, mobility, and awareness of colonial legacies and their continual operation. And also very much to make sure that and participate within a movement in modern languages that is explicitly concerned with its urgent topical concerns. I think in doing so, we were very conscious and wanting to pick up on the direction of travel within modern languages as a whole. And to ensure, above all, that there is a link between research and pedagogy. And that link is very firmly entrenched in the way that one thinks about research projects, that there isn't a distinction between research and pedagogy, but the two are conceived very much as something that is indivisible. And this is a principle that is extremely strong within the subsequent OWRI projects. And what we hope is that there is a proliferation of resources of the kind of which the series itself is one. So each volume contains between 16 and 20 essays, which are, broadly speaking, concerned with overlapping categories of language, the construction of the external world, the development of discourses over lengthy periods of time. We wanted to avoid any kind of presentism with which we looked at the object of study of modern languages, and how, in some shape or form, this is reflected in the individual experiences of the world. Just to conclude on one or two other things, the idea was very much to make a methodology present in the way in which we talk about modern languages. Not only how we can focus on different objects of study, but how we do so. And the instructions or request of each of the participating authors was really to talk about your object of research and explain how you approach it, what materials you look at, and what applications your particular approach has. And all the time to be student-focused in the way in which you talk and explain your research and its applications, so that the series is not a collection of textbooks, it's a collection, they are collections of student-focused papers which encourage one to reflect on the object, methodology, and applications of modern languages. To say just a couple more points, strongly the idea is that the relationship between language and cultural study, for us it is indivisible, and it is one of the defining aspects of modern language study, understood as a disciplinary field and a mode of linguistic and cultural interaction. And that feeds into the policy documents associated with the various projects on which people are concerned. Finally, the point that we want to make as contributors and editors of the series is that this is in no shape or form a definition of what modern languages is. Of course, modern languages as a disciplinary field is vast, it is complex, it obeys different frameworks. What we are concerned with is making sure that there is dialogue, interaction, connection between different areas of modern languages, and that it is taken as an expanding mode of disciplinary inquiry. We've concentrated on a series of texts to begin with, but it has always been our intention to expand that field, both thematically and geographically. I can't give too many details before contracts are issued about how that expansion will occur, but it is occurring. And I think that it is fundamentally important if one is to be thinking about how modern languages can define its place very robustly, both within a university economy and, of course, much more broadly within a societal context. What we wanted to do with this first presentation of the series as a whole was very much focus on the way in which the books can, could, potentially might be used in teaching contexts. And it's on that we want to focus and really organize the conversation as to how we have thought about the texts and to think about the ways in which they might be applied. And that's why we wanted to begin by talking about the handbook, the anchoring text of the series as a whole. And without more ado, I'll pass the word to our next speakers.
My name is Derek Duncan.
And I'm Jenny Burns, the other editor of the handbook.
We're going to be talking around a handbook. Slightly correct what Charles says, but it's very much in the spirit of the openness of the project that we refer to the book as a handbook rather than the handbook, because it is very much meant to contain suggestions for bringing together research and pedagogy in the way in which Charles has mentioned. So Jenny and I will talk through different aspects of a handbook, because in terms of the look, it's very different from the national, transnational volumes which have already appeared. First of all, I'd like to thank all our contributors, because as Charles says, this has been very much a collective project, and we've, in our volume, which contains 30 or so much shorter essays than in the national volumes, it really has been a collective project of patience as much as anything else on behalf of our contributors. And we're hoping that the book will actually appear early in 2021. The words which you should see on your screen just now are the chapter titles, the keywords which Jenny and I are going to refer to in the course of our short presentation. So rather than going through the different terms, the different words, they just give you a flavour of how they come together, because as we'll say, they will not be presented in any sequential order. They're supposed to kind of like touch on each other, interconnect, and stand opposed to each other in some respects for the reader as they experience the volume. I noticed that in the blog posts on the LUP website, the Portuguese editors, or the editors of the Portuguese volume, use the term methodological nationalism to kind of like characterize the way in which study in modern languages, teaching in modern languages, has perhaps obviously concentrated on the nation state, as Charles already mentioned, or at least the single language area. And the aim of the series, I suppose, is to kind of like start complicating our thinking around this reality, not least in the face of contemporary human mobility, but also thinking further back into the past. And I think it's interesting that, as Charles says, I mean, most of the volumes take a very long chronological perspective on this topic. and it was possibly our contributors in the early modern and medieval periods who most spontaneously understood the kind of cultural connectivities, the linguistic connectivities, which the project intended. So just to give you some sense of what a handbook is going to look like, it consists of something like 36 essays, each of about 3,000 words long. So roughly the length of essay which an undergraduate in the UK might be expected to complete. They're organised around words, the kind of keywords, and we'll come back to the choice and the function of these words later. And unlike the national transnational volumes, which focus still on a single language area, the essays in a handbook are drawn from a multiplicity of different national, transnational contexts, different cultural modalities, and different languages. And the idea is very much that the student reader, the researcher, should be engaging with, or ideally would engage with these essays through the prism of a transnational methodology. And this is one of the things which Charles was alluding to in his presentation. So rather than focusing on the nationally specific content of each essay, the reader, or at least the ideal reader, would move across the different areas, the different national areas, the different language areas, to identify research questions which might pertain to their particular area of expertise or interest. Some of the essays in the volume explicitly link cultures. For example, the essays on pre-modernities, performance, and flow very much look at how different cultures link or are connected together. Other essays reflect on a common issue. Most of the language essays come into that category. But I would draw attention particularly to the essay on voice, which is very much about the dynamics of speaking and also listening, and the relationality which the performative voicing of anything, of any kind of like cultural artifact, of any kind of conversation necessarily instantiates. And I think that kind of relationality is something that we would want we've asked our contributors, but also ideally our readers to reflect on. Some of the essays, on the other hand, invite the readers to make a kind of transnational parallel, drawing on their own knowledge or expertise. The cities essay, for example, is very much focused on violence and gender in Rio de Janeiro, but I think the reader might usefully extrapolate from that to reflect on other urban experiences. The essay on sound, the soundscapes of Buenos Aires, is interesting in all sorts of ways, because not least it invites us to reflect on ephemeral experience, which in a way is one of the things which we perhaps most commonly encounter in any cultural context. And that kind of ephemeral experience also folds into one of the aspects which we ask the contributor to reflect on, which is their own subjectivity. So essays such as liveness and event very much focus on how the author interprets, reflects on, and then writes about their own form of cultural encounter. Jenny, can I pass over to you now?
Yeah, thank you, Derek. And yes, I'll add my thanks to all the contributors for their essays, but also, as Derek pointed out, for their patience over what has been quite a long process of drawing these fantastic keywords and essays together. So I'm going to talk first just a little bit about the uses of a handbook that we envisaged. So as Derek, I think, has already suggested, our intention was not ever to define the keywords, define the terms or areas of inquiry, but rather to open up possibilities of thinking and to prompt rethinking as well of the different terms. We've envisaged no prescribed order of reading at all, and the essays aren't divided into sections. Our hope with a handbook is what readers will do is to select and organise and order their readings according to their own needs and also their own curiosity. And as Derek's pointed out, there's no steering towards particular languages. The keywords leave those references open. We're aware too that the keywords and terms are likely, we would hope they will, acquire new resonances over time and as research proceeds in those areas. So the openness of the essays, again, aims to accommodate that and even to foster that growing of the particular keywords and the research around them. And as that probably suggests, we would encourage rereadings over time, prompted by new study materials that a student may have encountered, by new questions that they're thinking about, by new languages they've encountered, and by individual experiences that prompt them to go back to a particular essay or a particular term. We'd also, of course, expect these are for use in teaching primarily, so teachers, fellow researchers may highlight a particular keyword or essay as a way of thinking through alternative perspectives on a familiar text or topic, and that's one way certainly we'd expect a handbook to be used. But again, from the individual reader's point of view, we'd hope the essays will be read in active dialogue with essays in the language-specific volumes in the rest of the series, but also I think much more widely with other critical materials and creative materials that individuals may be encountering. And I think we're particularly mindful of the fact that modern languages degrees have already changed, that students may be studying 3 or more languages within a modern languages degree, languages, 1 or 2 with which they may already be familiar, others which are completely new to them as they start university study. Also, a great strength of modern languages has always been its joint degrees with other disciplines, but those disciplines are now expanding. So joint degrees with languages in economics, politics, law. We would hope that the keywords in a handbook enable students to make those links between other disciplines and the modern languages which they're primarily engaged with. So I think, yeah, our vision, if we have one for a handbook, is really that it will be quite literally kept to hand as a reference point and a source of ideas and approaches throughout the course of a degree programme, and ideally also beyond. But at that point, I'll hand back again to Derek.
I think what Jenny and I would hope is emerging from what we've said already, that a handbook shouldn't be regarded as a textbook or a course book. It's much more a resource, a kind of compendium that students and possibly researchers too could hold on to, go back to, and use in parallel with the national books, but also as a way of engaging with the other kind of pedagogical research material which they will necessarily come into contact with. We can't really see any use for it as a course book, a book around which you could really structure a single course. But maybe we're wrong. So I just want to say something about the words which we're using, and keywords in a sense. The term which we have also used is slightly misleading, because we certainly wouldn't want to think that the words which we have adopted are in any sense the most important terms which might be used by researchers and students in modern languages, but we thought that they had the advantage of kind of like typicality, of openness, of usability, because we do want the book to be used and to be useful. The initial list of words was really just produced by Jenny and I, topics that we thought might be interesting and relevant. Some of the contributors that we approached suggested different terms for the terms which we'd initially proposed. And the list expanded really as time went on, sort of with the aim of inclusiveness, but not inclusiveness in the sense of trying to be complete, but rather to create balance, tensions, contradictions within the body of the text. As you've seen, the words are quite generic. Things like animal, borders, stories, they don't really give much away, and they certainly don't give anything away in terms of national context orientation. And that's obviously deliberate. Also, we've avoided named theories and the names of people. There's no reference to Marx, Rancière, or psychoanalysis, or any kind of like theoretical body of thought that we think that students might or should actually be engaging with. Although all of these figures, all of the expected figures really, and more familiar methodologies and some less familiar methodologies do actually appear in the essays themselves. Two terms which we were very conscious to avoid, though, which some people might expect to be there, are the terms gender and race. Our expectation, our hope, was that many of the contributors would be using gender and race as prisms through which to approach their topics anyway. And we certainly didn't want to ghettoize these terms by putting them in a separate category. Rather, we wanted to normalize the kind of readerly expectation to find these kind of issues in not every, but in most forms of analytical thinking, contemporary analytical thinking. So the terms, the words, the keywords really are prompts for critical reflection or analysis. And the essays come together in different ways. For example, if you were interested, say, in the environmental humanities, a number of the essays in a handbook approach these topics, but from really quite different directions and with quite different points of emphasis. And I think for Jenny and I, certainly, because we've had the advantage of reading all the essays, which few other people so far have, one of the interesting ways in which the volume actually works is that it allows the reader to create patterns of connection, which are really unpredictable, are certainly unpredictable to us as editors, and will depend very much on local or personal interest. And I think Jenny is going to carry on by saying something about the authors, the contributors to the book.
Yes, I'll just say a little bit about the authors, because as Derek's indicated, the diversity of the authors in, I hope, the most sort of loose and diverse sense of that term, was something that we were really concerned to build, so that we could be as inclusive as possible of perspectives on the keywords and on the business of modern languages. So the authors come from a huge range of backgrounds in terms of languages and also language settings. So clearly the European languages, originally European languages, which are at the centre of the series so far, are well represented, but also other languages from across the globe. And I think more particularly European languages in settings outside of Europe, and in settings in which they're in close proximity and relation with other languages which are non-European. So, for example, we have French in Namibia, Italian in Chile, multilingualism in medieval Eurasia, and translation in medieval Iberia. The authors also come from a huge range of disciplines. So those disciplines close to modern languages that we're familiar with: translation studies, literary and film studies, also sociolinguistics, but going as far as marine archaeology and textile arts. And as Derek has already pointed out, they work in a range of periods from the medieval to the present. And as has been said, some of the most sort of surprising and really sort of forceful work in the volume in a handbook comes from those colleagues working in the medieval, for whom the cross-cultural connections are part of everything they do and the way in which their work is based. Authors also bring a huge range of methodologies to the volume, so historiographic, ethnographic, linguistic analysis, and also philosophical and theoretical reflections. And again, these weave in and out of different essays in sometimes surprising ways. From all this follows, I think, that the range of geographical locations that the authors come from spans, I think, probably all continents, and also, importantly, regions and spaces within continents and within nations. And ultimately running as deep as the seabed of the Mediterranean. So they write about these locations, and also in various ways they engage themselves with those locations. And it's often, in many of the essays, the interaction between the author's home location, if we call it that, and their home language, and the object of their inquiry that surfaces as very interesting as a model of transnational work in modern languages. So to illustrate that with one example, one contributor is based at Nottingham Trent University in French studies. She writes for the volume about Vietnam and wrote whilst residing in Vietnam and also teaching in China. So I think that gives a nice sort of representation of how the volume moves across the globe in various ways. Another element of diversity amongst the authors is the range of career stages and pathways. So from early career researchers to quite established professorial colleagues. And it's not so much the sort of the hierarchies, the levels that are important there, but I think the research pathways that indicates and the places that their essays come from. So for some of them, the keyword that they write about is absolutely at the centre of a current project, maybe a time-limited project, which they're very closely engaged with. For others, the keyword comes from research and reflection based on professional practice, on pedagogical work, on creative practice. For others, the keyword is, or their response to the keyword is based on long-term expertise in a discipline encompassing multiple different specialisms. And I think what this all points to, and what we really invited authors to do, was to write as current live researchers, in effect, caught in the act of critical practice. So we asked them explicitly not to define, not to lay claim to the keyword they were writing on, but instead to display the ways in which knowledge is actively produced, and in so doing to invite readers to draw on their own expertise and experience, and in a sense to co-produce knowledge through the reading of the essay. So I think the final point, what that points to, is that we hope to engage in a handbook with the authors, but also with the readers as simply human individuals. And we asked them to be as subjective as they felt comfortable with being in their essay, and really to articulate the lived experience which informs their research, but more particularly the lived experience of doing research or study in modern languages. And I think, unless Derek wants to add anything, that's us done.
I think it is.
Right. So I think if, unless Derek wants to come back in, which doesn't look like it, it's I'll take over from here and move us on to the next phase. So at this point, hopefully, we've given you a sense of what we've been trying to do with the series, and in particular what a handbook is trying to achieve. Rather than trying to then offer you a description of each individual volume in the series, and from the start, again, we tried to be not too prescriptive. We kept saying from the early meetings with all the fantastic colleagues who engaged in the effort of producing the individual volumes, we kept saying that we wanted volumes that had a sort of family resemblance, but which were each one individual in its own way. So rather than giving you an individual description of each volume, we thought we'd invite some guests to engage with the material and to give you a sense of what they found. I'll introduce them briefly and then give you a little bit of a context for what we've asked them to do, and then pass it on to them. So the four colleagues are Claire Gorara, Rachel Scott, Kumbola Ramadani Musta, and Anna de Medeiros. They're all colleagues who are involved in the UK higher education sector in the field of modern languages. All of them have different profiles, different language and cultural backgrounds. They're at different stages in their careers. They have different interests. They all also share a broad view, I would say, on modern languages, and a view that goes beyond the specific context of the UK and takes us in other directions and to other locations. And Claire Gorara is, I'll introduce them in the order in which we'll ask them to speak briefly. Claire Gorara is Professor of French and was also the founding head of the School of Modern Languages at Cardiff University. She is currently the chair of the University of Council of Modern Languages in the UK, and she's engaged in a project that supports language learning in schools and school outreach in Wales in particular. She's published on research on mentoring and on language learning in secondary schools, as well as on areas of French, contemporary French culture. She's particularly interested in multilingualism, in curriculum reform, and she is a wonderful colleague at Cardiff, as well as a self-confessed language activist. Rachel Scott is currently a lecturer in World and Hispanic Literature at Royal Holloway, and she was before a postdoctoral research assistant with the OWRI, the Open World Research Initiative project, Language Acts of World Making at King's College in London. And she remains also associated and affiliated as a researcher with King's and with that project. She's worked for her doctoral project on the early reception, the modern reception of the Celestina in Spain and in Italy. And her book won a prize from the Association of Hispanists of Great Britain. Kombola Ramadani Musa holds a PhD in Italian Studies from Reading University and is currently a Leverhulme Research Fellow at Cardiff. And she has worked on orality and on multilingual writing. And her current work explores the creation of a post-colonial and multicultural Italian identity, focusing on the specific case of the Italian Zigula, an ethnic group based in Somalia and Tanzania. And finally, Anna Dimitaris is director of the Modern Language Centre at King's College London. She has published mainly on the work of Francophone and Lusophone women, and in recent years, in particular, on gender and narratology in the works of Marie Nimier. She's co-editing at present a third volume of essays on Nimier, which comes from an event which was hosted actually by the IMLR. And I should add, last week, Portuguese Studies published a translation by Anna and by João Silvestre of an interview with Dulce Maria Cardoso given to Paulo de Medeiros and Geronimo Pizarro at KLCL. So you can see already the range of interests and the range of disciplinary areas that are covered by our four speakers. But more than speakers, they are our first readers, or some of our first readers. All of them have had access to some of the material. Some of them, in particular Claire, has read some of the essays from a handbook, and Claire has also seen some of the material from the French volume. Anna has looked at the Portuguese volume. Rachel has looked at the Spanish. Kombola has looked at the Italian. Again, we couldn't be fully comprehensive. That's not the intention of this. But what we asked them to think about were some framing questions. What are the distinctive or the innovative traits in the materials that they have seen? How can they, if they can, imagine using this material with the students in the context that they engage with? And can we also think about ways in which, as Charles was saying at the beginning, these materials, the series, a handbook, help us to think about the future of modern languages, the future of our discipline. Most of all, I'll pass this on now first to Claire, as I said, and then we'll move on to Rachel, Kombola, and Anna. Most of all, we want to ask them, as our first readers, what did you read? What were your first impressions? And also, what questions do these materials raise for you? And I'll ask Claire to take on from there, if I may.
Thank you very much, Loridana. So I've read some of the keyword entries into a handbook, and I've read the introduction to the French Studies volume. And I think sort of 3 words sum up my first impressions. The first is captivating. The second is inspiring. And the third is informative, because you've always got more to learn. It's a very, very diverse and pluralistic world when you start to look at everything through the transnational frame. So I'm going to sort of just give a brief sense of my first reactions by talking about, I suppose, to begin with choices. Then I want to have a think about approaches, and I then want to end with voices. So when it comes to choices, and I think I particularly focus here on a handbook, I was very intrigued by the 36 keywords or categories that were nominated for the volume. There are 3 around translation and 2 around me, and I thought that was really intriguing. It's very true, as Derek and as Jenny picked up, the national evaporates. When I read about 4 or 5 of the essays on Sunday afternoon, and it's true, Derek and Jenny, I dipped. I wanted to dip around. I didn't follow a journey through. My narrative journey was very much looking at words that sparked my imagination. And I also didn't have any of the authors' names next to the essays. So I actually really did appreciate the fact that I was not reading. I wasn't author-centric, I was word-centric. I went more on the keyword title, and that really did liberate me from expectation around particular things that particular authors might or might not say. I found that actually very liberating, and I wasn't looking for Professor X or lecturer Y on a certain topic. I was very open. I've got no idea who wrote which of the essays in a handbook, and I really did appreciate that openness to variety and profusion of perspectives. I like the national evaporated. I really like very much that they became jump points, the essays, for thinking very, very laterally about things. So when I read, for example, around translation, the one I picked there was very philosophical and took me back to Aristotle and beyond, and put me through to German philosophers. I really enjoyed that very, very multimodal, national and multilingual leap across different time zones and categories. My question around the first of choice would be, obviously there are things that I was expecting that might be there. And I get Jenny and Derek's point that really it's about a starting point for discussion, not an end point. But my question would be to Jenny and to Derek would be, I didn't see visual there. I was surprised. There was sound, but there wasn't sight. That was interesting. I think there were 3 stories or 2 stories, but there weren't any histories, and that was intriguing in itself. And there were past, but there weren't any futures. Now, I'm not saying they weren't there because there were lots of roots, but I was very intrigued by the, I suppose, the responsive nature of your keywords, but what wasn't there. And of course, what wasn't there is also a point for students who are using the handbook to ask their lecturers and their teachers, could I write an essay on the future? Could I write the essay on the past? What about history? So in a way, I think what wasn't there would be generative of students writing these 3,000 word entries themselves, given the right curriculum structure. So in a way, as a teaching resource, what wasn't there, it could be a great place to start students writing what could be there. And you could have a student companion volume, which literally students respond to your handbook with their handbook. That's how things do. Secondly, about approaches, I was in the essays that I read, I was very, very intrigued by a very, very big swing or sway between the experiential and the deeply discipline-specific and theoretical. And there was a massive, massive swing from the ones that I read, from those which were very based in the autobiographical and experiential, particularly around me, obviously, and those that were very, very embedded in what I would say very deeply constructed and deeply embedded discipline-specific areas with spheres of knowledge. So I think the book does require the reader to be prepared to switch very massively from deep-bedded knowledge frames and spheres of experience, spheres of understanding, to what I would call much more experientially and you might call that reader-centric approaches. But I think in a way that is one thing I'm intrigued by. How did you balance that yourselves between the deeply intellectually specialist through to the very experientially driven pieces? I'd be intrigued to know how you manage that sway. It's not wrong or right. It's a very big sway. You had to balance in very, very different approaches there. I enjoyed that very much, but that was interesting as to how you balance that yourselves. And then lastly, around voices, and I want to use the word connectivity at all. What I really loved about it was that most of the essays were questioning. They asked questions. They talked about threads. They connected up nations, peoples, places, themes. They were not geographically specific. I love the one about bilingualism, which looked at being Latino in America and thinking about schooling and language and culture, and challenging some of the language and language blind policies of the US government. I thought that was really, really intriguing. I also loved the essay on creativity and around craftism, being an activist around craft. I love that. And I think I wanted to bring out the last centres in that essay, which I really thought did for me encapsulate the volume. I'm going to replace the word text and pattern, or textile and pattern, with language. If I do it, I'll say languages and languages allow us to think creatively about being human as we live in the everyday, but influencing and making the world we want to be within. The other essay using textile and pattern for that, language was really, could have easily been the surrogate, the substitute for the word text and textile. And therefore, for me, as a student-centred experience, it also created a sense of a community of intellectuals, scholars, students with whom my students could be engaged. There was openness to a pluralism of voices, and there was a very strongly driven by curiosity, discovering new things. And this around creativity and patterning was about working with thread and embroidery with refugee communities in Dunkirk. Now, that's an activist mindset for me, but the whole essay was about how you then weave together experience of those refugee groups, the colleague themselves, the practitioner, and her academic, I think, daughter. The really, really strong way in which that essay brought together practice, creativity, and intellectual inquiry. And I want my students to be able to do that, to be both intellectually astute, actively minded, and able to practice what they read. And I think that's what I think I got out of it. I got this whole notion of that Jones at the end there of being caught in the act of critical practice. I found myself caught in that act, and I would hope that the compendium itself and the resource helps our students to do that. So for me, choice, tone, and voice would be three ways that I would use a handbook to structure an experience with students and to also inform myself on my own practice.
Okay, well, thank you, Claire, and thank you also for the questions. A reminder to everyone else also in the audience, if this is an audience, I don't know, everyone else who's connected, that as Naomi said at the start, if you got questions, please do convey them to her in particular, and we will pick them up once the discussion as such kicks off. But in the meantime, if I can now ask Rachel to come in, please. There we go, Rachel, thank you.
So I firstly want to thank Catherine and Rory for what was a very thought-provoking read. I very much enjoyed it. I was looking at the Spanish volume, and I read the introduction as well as dipping into a few essays in each of the sections. And so, Loridana, to respond to your points, for me, what struck me as most innovative to begin with was what I felt was a very clear, deliberate emphasis on language. This came across in the introduction in particular, but also in the first section, which is themed language. And I felt that it's clear that you're making a strong case here for the role and importance of language as being at the heart of the modern languages discipline, albeit one that is inherently interdisciplinary. And I just wanted to pick out a couple of quotes from the introduction that I found that really spoke to me. You said how languages and cultures operate. This was a book about how languages and cultures operate and interact across diverse axes of connection, and also about how language can be understood not merely as a system of communication, but a means of interpreting the world. And so again, this whole first section devoted to language, which encompassed discussions of a transnational and historical development, but also brought into play the other languages of medieval Iberia, of Arabic and Hebrew, and of course the indigenous languages of the New World and Latin America. But I found that it was something that was sort of underpinning quite a few of the contributions outside of this initial section. So I was particularly struck by a couple that seemed to be sort of foregrounding how use of language and naming is an important act of world making, really demonstrating what you were trying to get across in the introduction. I suppose the other thing that I was struck by is the geographical and historical range that was on show here. And I think it really worked that it wasn't structured in terms of periods or in structured regions, but the way that the book is structured into these 4 sections, language, temporalities, spatialities, and subjectivities, it really puts times and places into dialogue with one another. As somebody who is a medievalist and early modernist by background, I was also pleased to see, a rather considerable emphasis on the importance of pre-19th century examples of the transnational, of globality, really making the point that this isn't a modern phenomenon, this isn't anything new, what we're dealing with, and really showing how ideological uses, quite a few of the contributions really brought into play how the history of the Spanish-speaking world, of Iberia is put to use ideologically now as well, or throughout time. So there was a real sense of breadth and scope of the different parts of the world that had been touched by or influenced by or encountered with Spanish language and Hispanic or Iberian language and culture. And I was also struck by a sense in the contributions of movement and mobility across times and across places, and I think that's enabled by the structure that you had put in place in the book. And again, breaking down, I think as Charles mentioned, this desire to break down or to cross the frontiers and cross borders of nations and the national. Again, another thing that I found useful, and I will come back perhaps more specifically to how I would use it as a teacher, but another thing I found useful was this range of materials the media engaged with, the types of cultural outputs, some of which seem to me to be very much non-canonical. So bringing to students' attention authors or texts or perspectives that they may not have otherwise encountered or so far encountered. And as I said, this range of cultural outputs, from the literary, different genres, magazines, poetry, the digital, social media, art, music, what else was there? Art, music, oral testimonies as well, which I think was important, and technology. And I think that this makes the volume useful to those of us who, modern languages degrees are inherently interdisciplinary, right? So we're not only teaching language, we are teaching visual cultures, we're teaching art history in some cases, we're teaching cultural studies. And so I think this makes it of use to many of us in modern languages today. I suppose my second to last point was the timeliness of many of the issues and the themes current. These are long-standing, some of them, long-standing issues that we have dealt with across decades, which I think have been brought into recent weeks, months, years to more sharpened poignancy and necessity of dealing with. So you mentioned in your introduction a desire to decolonize knowledge hierarchies, to decolonize curricula, the issues here of globalization, the glocal, the tension between the global and the local, subjectivities encompassing aspects of the Black Atlantic, of slavery, race, gender, disability studies as well. And again, returning to things that we're still grappling with in the UK and indeed across the world, like empire, like the histories of colonization, of decoloniality. And so I felt it was very timely intervention into the area. And that in terms of disciplinary identities, I mentioned already about, that I felt there was a real deliberate focus on language, but also, this is a book I think that brings into play not only cultural studies of visual arts, it engages with aspects of diaspora studies and also of world literature. I noticed this was a term that came up on several occasions in some of the essays. And I'm thinking of my own institutional context here in Royal Holloway. We're launching a new degree programme in world and comparative literature and culture, which is going to be housed in the Department of Language, Literatures and Cultures. And so for me, this couldn't have come at a better time. This was really thought-provoking in terms of thinking, well, how could I use these materials across the from first to final year across this new degree programme that we're developing. And I think it also, although not all of the contributors mentioned world literature, I think it's quite clear that many of them, or a few of them, make very strong contributions to this, showing how Hispanic, Iberian, Spanish studies, this problem of terminology again can really contribute to an area that has otherwise been dominated quite strongly by the Anglophone. So I think this is making the case for modern languages within world literature as a discipline, within comparative literature, and this real strength of the volume is that aspect of the transnational. I think that's all I had to say in terms of my reaction as a researcher and a teacher. It was very thought-provoking. And my questions for Rory and Catherine, well, the first one is, how did the sections come about? They're very useful, very interesting. How did they come about? What was the reason for choosing language, temporalities, spatialities, subjectivities? And secondly, is there anything as editors that you look back on the volume and think that you've not included or covered that you wish you could have done? Yeah. That will be it. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And not to answer questions unduly, but you by picking up on the sections, you've picked up actually on part of that family resemblance that I was talking about. So that was part of the initial discussion, and those 4 sections are recurrent, not in exactly the same way, but tend to be recurrent across quite a few of the volumes. Following on from Rachel, Kombola, can I ask you to come up now? Thank you so much. So, Kombola, you read the Italian studies, or the transnational Italian studies volume. Yeah.
And I will start with my reaction. When I was reading the book, the first things which came in my mind was the famous TED talk by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She's a Nigerian writer, and the TED talk is entitled "The Danger of a Single Story." She explained how we do not have to be satisfied with a single story, but she invites us to discover new and unexpected narratives so that we can also look at the same things with a different perspective. She adds that engaging with a place or a person requires try to engage to all the story of that place and that person, while by sticking to a single story, we are condemned to an incomplete knowledge. And this has been a kind of mantra for me when I was reading the book, because the first idea I had was that approaching modern languages studies with a national perspective, which still follows the guideline of an established canon, especially at the present, seem to present the same kind of danger or risk described by the Nigerian writer. And I think it's very important to give the student, thinking of student readership, a more complete knowledge about what is Italian culture and what is Italian studies about. So a transnational perspective, in this sense, offer a very broad and deeper comprehension of the Italian context and its complexity. But what I really like is the fact that in a certain way, a transnational approach function also as a reminder of the fact that even in a globalized world, the national as a framework is still very powerful. They coexist, the transnational and the national, and what the transnational allow us to do is to look at the national frameworks and to try to transcend it and try to look behind it. And this is something which came in my mind when I was reading one of the final essay, one devoted to Dante and the transnational turn, because when we think of Dante, of course, Dante is unanimously recognized as the father of the Italian language, and finding out that background, his cultural background was so complex. As we are not talking just about diglossia, so the distinction between Latin and vernacular, but also all French and Occitan were involved. So in Dante context, translation was very important, and this is another aspect I really like in the book, the fact that they invite us to look at translation not as a simple way to literally move a text from one language into another, but help us to discover a lot about the connection between the national and the transnational. Another point I really like is the fact that when I was thinking about the transnational, I would assume that was more about the global, but there are many essays which actually analyze very local realities. And I'm thinking of Sambuca in Sicily and Centro Narelli in Bologna, but also the classroom in La Mia Classe, an Italian film. I'm not an expert teacher, so I have questions and I don't have answer. I would like to know if there are specific challenge from a pedagogic point of view, how you can actually make the transnational and the national to coexist, especially in terms of curriculum. And have you thought about a specific methodology or kind of tools so we can use? Because reading the different essays is very clear how they, of course, the authors present the research and the kind of methodologies and approach they use. But is there something more general? And another question, but this is more my curiosity, I would like to know more about the connection between the global and the local. It has been a very, very interesting reading, and I would like, to have the opportunity to study the book as a student, not just to teach it. But thank you very much.
Again, thanks, Kumbola, and thanks also for bringing up that tension, which has been there from the beginning. And I think Charles was saying at the start, we have no illusion that we can resolve that tension, but we've continued to make the point that the national and the transnational are not somehow a substitute for each other, but rather exist in that tension that you were talking about. Finally, Anna, are you still there?
Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Loridana. And it's been, first of all, I'd like obviously to thank Claire and Hilary for the wonderful work they've done editing this volume. I was lucky enough to be able to look at the manuscript before the publication. And also just now listening to Claire and Rachel and Kumbola and the other speakers, it struck me how a number of the things that they could say or that they were saying about the volumes they were talking about, I could have said, or I had thought about this volume. And I think that's amazing when you are talking about the variety, not just in each volume, but of indeed the whole series, and that yet the coherence of the ideas presented really comes through. I think the other thing too is the volumes really initiate a conversation, and the comments, in a sense, that I'm going to make are comments that have arisen because of already back and forth between me and the editors. And I think the pieces really encourage that, a conversation that students and researchers will follow on because of the questioning voices, because of the richness of the presentation and the variety. So there's an internal dialogue, I would say, between the text within the volume. I think there's also a dialogue between the various volumes, and that kind of voice and those kinds of questions make the reader want to participate further and participate actively. But I guess some of the points that I wanted to raise and then some questions are really, how did the editors and the contributors use the transnational turn to devise a new methodological toolkit which opens up new perspectives on the social, linguistic, and cultural movements and interactions across borders of Portuguese-speaking peoples, texts, images, and ideas? In this, the concept of the transnational is seen as being quite distinct from the homogenizing forces of globalization or the mythical historical discourse, recovery and expansion. Rather, the transnational affords precisely a series of theoretical positions from which to deconstruct Portugal's conventional role as the expansionist founder of globalization, or que deu mundos ao mundo. Perhaps also thinking about how, building on this, some of the chapters in this collection explicitly take up the challenge of displacing and deauthorizing the Eurocentric notion of lusophonia that has too often governed the teaching and research in Portuguese studies. It's also clear that the contributors have chosen a wide array of cultural objects to study, going well beyond traditional curricular foci on literary texts. And that's really one of the richness of the volume. This reflects the very varied range of cultural materials that most Portuguese studies programs now consider. And I guess another thing that I wasn't expecting when I picked up the volume and started reading it, and I don't think it's just because we've been in lockdown and been working from home and following the news perhaps even more carefully than usual, that a number of these texts, as I was reading them, really had echoes on the movements, the political movements that our students, that our colleagues are involved in. And they speak to, so I think that it will be very productive first for, when we return to teaching in the autumn, to engage the students, to make the links between the conversation in here and then link it perhaps to Black Lives Matters or other movements that are very much at the forefront of what our students are thinking about. And that's a richness that they could see that Portuguese studies is not something that exists in a book or something that was only important when we were talking about the descobrimentos, but really that it's very much alive now. And that the authors and the film directors that use Portuguese as a language are contributing to a very international discourse that has an impact on the students in a very real way, and staff. So some of the just three short questions, I hope, is really as a researcher, as an academic, as a teacher, how do we talk about a Portuguese language? I know we talked in the beginning about whether it's the handbook or a handbook, but how do we speak about a Portuguese language which has two major official variants in the classroom and many more in global daily spoken practice? And when in reality, many of our own students in the classroom will be heritage speakers from a variety of backgrounds and have encountered different forms of Portuguese. It's also perhaps challenging to understand how the volume was put together and to understand that the challenges that the editors had to face, how did they manage the sheer regional, historical, and political diversity of the territories under discussion? How did they manage to do this working always across boundaries to find significant nodal points of transnational, transcultural, or translingual interest, which is evident in the volume? And finally, two connected questions. How did they decide to order the four sections? So as you mentioned before, there's coherence across the volume: space, language, temporality, and subjectivity. And this is an unashamed call out to Claire to tell us a little bit more about the story of the beautiful photograph that is the cover of the volume. And if she can tell us a little bit more about how that came about. It's a photo taken by Claire in Macau in 2007. Thank you, Naomi, for bringing it up. There it is. And finishing is just that, going back to what I mentioned in the beginning about how the volume opens up a dialogue, that was already very evident in a part of a volume that usually you wouldn't think of, but in the acknowledgements page. So right at the beginning, there is a dialogue between Claire and Hilary, where they thank each other for their contribution and how they work together. And just in those two small paragraphs, you see the richness, the collaboration, the appreciation of a culture, and the respect also for the work that they each brought to the volumes, and of course of all the contributors. So I can only thank them for the very uplifting experience that they've created with this volume, and that I know that readers will really appreciate.
Right. Well, thank you, Anna, and thanks again to Claire and to Rachel and to Kumbola. And again, a lot of issues that have come up. I would say at this point, we can open up the discussion, in particular to the editors of the volumes. A number of them are with us. I'm looking at Claire on my screen at present, Claire Williams, but also there's a number of the editors here. And of course, also a number of the editors of the volumes that we haven't had specific comments about, but the Russian volume, the German volume, and as I said, all of them have this family resemblance in a way, but all of them very much their individuality. I've taken some notes, and sort of the questions that have come up to me are grouping around a few themes that seem very central. One is the question of choice, of inclusion and exclusion, of managing the multitude and the infinite possibility of what could have been included in a volume, and of course we can't include everything. Another is the question of that structure and that family resemblance with those keywords of subjectivity, temporality, spatiality, language, and in particular then within that, the question of language and the role of language. The other tension, the tension between transnational and national, a tension which I think I certainly I can say from my point of view, we had no illusion of resolving, but at the same time, a crucial question that we all had to deal with. The fantastic question about also co-research and participation, and how these volumes continue to, well, we're born out of co-research and of collaboration amongst a large number of researchers, but also invite participation. And I loved Claire's idea. Maybe we should have it online, you know, a companion of student essays on additional topics. And then how all of this pushes us towards that debate, which is not just a UK debate, but an international debate about modern languages, about the discipline, about its future, about the tension between the Anglophone and the variety of languages that we want to continue to learn, to love, and to work with. And of course, finally, the question of that beautiful photograph and many others. So can I open it to any of the editors who want to come in and comment or respond to any of these questions? And I'll ask Naomi whether there's a way that she wants to do this, but I think we can just allow people to unmute themselves, probably. Is that the way?
So we've got some other questions from the audience, so I'm just keeping track of them, but we can go to them after we've kind of responded.
So in the first instance, I would say if any of the volume editors would like to intervene, and that includes, of course, Charles, Jenny, and Derek, though we've had our share. So if anybody else wants to come in, please do jump in.
Yeah, the editors can also raise their hands if you want to signal you'd like to come in on this question.
I could come in on some of Claire's questions about a handbook and Derek as well, I guess. Yeah, thank you, Claire. We've sent collections of essays to various readers, but it's really great to hear live the comments of a reader, and to hear, some of the adjectives you used, which are probably just what we were looking for, I hope, in lots of ways. Your questions are really interesting. The one I was just going to reply on, because you drew attention really to that swing that you commented on between disciplinary specialism and the more experiential, which is really interesting. And when you asked how we manage that and balance it, Derek may have done this without my knowing, but I'm not sure we have actively managed and balanced it. But it's something that we're very aware of, that the essays take different approaches. But I think that draws attention to something which was important to us with a handbook, but to the whole series, I think, was taking care not just to sweep away certain very productive and useful practices of research and teaching in modern languages that have long been present in the discipline, in order to replace them with new modes of research. We wanted to, perhaps we'd see the swing more as a dialogue, and we'll think about this as we finally edit the volume, whether the dialogue is there. But it was very important for us to include what you might regard as some of the more sort of conventional approaches to research, to some of the theorists that Derek referred to earlier on, who are all present in different ways in the volume, but precisely to have them present in different ways from the familiar ones, and to be sort of sitting alongside essays which work in a very different way and a more, as you say, experiential way with the business of studying and doing modern languages. Yeah, I think that's all I want to say. Derek, I don't know if you want to say more on the words that are missing. There are lots of them.
Yeah, just to echo Jenny's thanks to you, Claire, for such a generous and I would say insightful reading of our project. Yeah, the missing words, I think, are essential. It goes back to the idea that we never had any ambition for completeness, and I think that's true for all the national volumes as well. And in a sense, we wanted to avoid also the most obvious words, really as a way of inviting the reader to pick up on other terms and think about it precisely in the way in which the ways in which you've mentioned. With specific references to the visual, very quickly, lots of the essays actually do engage with visual culture. And in a sense, we would say that's the strength of the volume, that the visual, just as Jenny said about various other theorists and theoretical like bodies of thought, they appear in unexpected places. And I think, in a way, we would encourage the reader, the student, to look for the unexpected uses of the visual, rather than going to a chapter which was called film, for example, or comics. And while these media are represented, they're not isolated, they're not ghettoized, they're not characterized in quite that way. Right. But yeah, it's not complete.
Thanks, Derek. I would like to invite Claire and Hilary and Catherine and Rory to respond to some of the questions that went to them, but also, and maybe even more, to invite Connor and Ben and Rebecca to perhaps comment on whether what was said about some of the other volumes they felt also related to their own efforts with the German and the Russian books. So in whichever order, please just jump in.
I mean, one good place to start with this question between the coexistence of the national and the transnational, and how one works with the global and the local that Kombola was talking in particular about. That's something we've all struggled with, and it's something and a question that is there are different ways in which one can approach this question. Not that one can come up with answers, but I think that would be very interesting to hear how other editors of the volume. I think the Russian blog talks very interestingly about this in particular. So without wishing to sort of place anyone on the spot, perhaps Connor might want to say a couple of things about that to begin with.
Yeah, thanks very much. Can everyone hear me okay? Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep. Yes.
Yeah, so the discussion today has been...
Oops.
Russian volume, and I suppose Russian studies always has a little bit of anxiety. Modern languages department, we always feel like we're a little bit of the outliers, all of the movements and so on. Romanticism, realism, modernism all comes kind of 30, 40 years later to Russia than it does to Western Europe. And one of the really rewarding things about working in the transnational project was to see actually just how much continuity and overlap there is between Russia and some of the Western European languages. To speak specifically about kind of the local and the global, I think those are really emerging trends at the moment in Russian studies, and our volume was able to kind of capitalize on that to some extent and contribute to what's become a really important debate. So within the past kind of 10 years, there's been a real reevaluation of the Russian provinces, which were often kind of seen as they were imagined in 19th century literature as this kind of, empty Gogolian space. And there's been a lot of really quite valuable revisionist work on local and regional identities in Russia. And as I say, we've been able to speak to that in our volume to some degree. But perhaps more than that, we have also been able to offer what I think is a bit of a corrective to some of what the Russian government has been doing in the past 20 years. So particularly since Putin's Munich speech in 2009, he's really tried to set up this idea of Russia as a kind of alternative PowerPoint in the world. So he talks all the time about, the problems with a unipolar world where the USA is at the head, and he speaks about the need for a multipolar world. And of course, this is inclusive language, but what he's really saying is that he wants Russia to have its own sphere of influence, and he's trying to carve out a kind of a transnational role for Russia. So several of the contributors in the final section of our book, Russia Goes Global, have really sort of responded to this and done, I think, some really valuable critical work on, say, what the Russian government has been trying to do with policing the internet and, building their own national RUNet to delimit foreign influence in Russia with the laws that have come in on foreign ownership of media in the Russia and so on. So our volume kind of emerged at a historical moment, I think, that proved to be very propitious for Russian studies and indeed for Russia on the world stage.
Excellent, thanks. I have in my sides, she says, I have Ben as well, and Rebecca has disappeared, but from the screen, but I can see she's there. So do you want to say something as well, Ben, Rebecca?
Well, I think that obviously Rebecca and I also consistently faced this question of the relationship between the national and the transnational, and in all sections of the book we tried to tackle it head on, but I guess most obviously in our section on spatiality, so this familial resemblance between the volumes, we gave ours subtitles, and our subtitle for the spatiality section was Mapping Nations, Mapping Networks. And in that we quite deliberately actually also map very national spaces, but in using lots of different interdisciplinary techniques for mapping those spaces, we tried to showcase and reveal to our kind of student readers and to colleague readers too, how even when you're mapping seemingly the most national of sites, there are always transnational entanglements within them, because of course the transnational is the precursor to the nation as well as the post-national state, and therefore the national is inherently transnational anyway. And so what appears to be a tension very quickly dissolves, and you are able to decenter the national to be able to come back to it with renewed different critical questions. And I think that's quite important when thinking about our student readers too, because although they might be doing German or French or Italian or Portuguese in all sorts of different combinations, not just with other languages, but with other subjects and disciplines, they're bringing with them their own expertise from those other disciplines and subjects, which we want them to apply to, in our case, German. But we also want them but they also have certain expectations still about what it might mean to do German. And so we need to acknowledge that in order to be able to decenter it and deterritorialize it. And I think in that way, that section on mapping nations wasn't just about mapping national spaces, but then mapping the transnational networks, as is, tracing filmmakers and artworks and artists as they move in and out and across borders, but also kind of mapping the networks, the kind of flow of methodologies and disciplines that happens when you're a student of the modern languages. People have already said modern languages is inherently interdisciplinary, which is both our power and sometimes our problem in articulating our value. So actually really making sure that that's a value. So you're bringing in something from sociology or from comparative literature or from film studies or from your other subjects. And then that allows us to map these spaces in lots of different ways. And so Rebecca's work in particular, I don't mean to shout her out in particular, but she's been using methods from the social sciences, kind of actor network theory, to think about how we map something inherently, seemingly very, very German, kind of Goethe, and the canon, but also that notion of world literature, which comes back to this notion in German of Weltliteratur. And there you see immediately the transnational imbrication in something that is also simultaneously national. So it's really about simultaneities and giving students the tools, the critical tools, to pull apart these simultaneities. I don't know if you want to say anything.
Yeah, Rebecca, do you disagree?
Oh yeah, my work's great. No, so I've been really enjoying all of the discussion so far, and you asked Loridana, did we feel that the comments that had been made of the other volumes applied to our own? And I think yes, very much so. And I had been going to pick up that point that Ben then did so nicely. It's absolutely not only my work in the volume. There are a number of essays in the German volume that address the question of kind of world literature and, and also sort of world film production, very head on. So that's something that we've really enjoyed exploring. I was kind of thinking as this conversation has been unfolding about one thing. Sometimes it's important to challenge as well, right? So we're in the celebratory mode, and I mean my challenge from the celebratory position. But I thought I'd share with you some thoughts I've been having about the sort of the transnationalizing one's contributors, which I thought was really important, that we need to be really open to different traditions of doing the different language disciplines, and think about how to give those space in the volume. And as far as I'm aware, all volumes tried, really hard to be aware of this and come up with good solutions. And I think the German volume is no different. But I would certainly share that I think probably for the first time on an editing project, and this has now followed me onto another editing project, I found myself thinking, of course, we operate within a very specific scholarly mode ourselves. And when you try to go to other quite different cultures and say, please can I have a 6,000 word essay delivered to such and such a deadline, and it has to look like this, then, you don't even really articulate some of what you're expecting because you're schooled in a tradition. And then you get what comes back, and it doesn't look anything like what you expected, because the person who's contributing is coming from a very different standpoint. So I just kind of wanted to put that to the community of people who are listening. I think this is a very real challenge when putting together projects like these. And we have to be aware that what we end up with and what we're communicating to our students looks a certain way. And, I was kind of thinking about, maybe it was Claire said with reference to the handbook or a handbook, perhaps we would encourage students to write versions of those short essays. So I was just kind of thinking about, what kind of messages are we sending out about what academic work looks like in terms of our own cultural parameters and expectations? And so there we go. That's a sort of a semi-challenge and a reflection ethically on what we're doing in this project as well.
A very interesting challenge, and one that reminds me of discussions that I've been having recently, mostly because of Francesca Vigliani, who's on this call, and her challenges about how we use the languages of a variety of disciplines and how complicated that can be. Can I go back to Claire and Hilary and Catherine and Rory if they want to intervene at this point, and then we will definitely open up to the questions that Naomi has been collecting for us.
Claire Launchbury is ready with a comment on French
Go on.
volume.
Claire, off you go.
Hello. Sorry, and I'm sorry that we're not with you in finishing quite yet. But one of the things that came up when we were reading and invited readers to look at the introduction, and I know Claire was very warm in her comments about our introduction, was people positing the difference between the international and the transnational, largely because we open with an anecdote about an airport and it being an international airport, and how that might confuse students. Where do you cite the difference between the international, the transnational? And we were using Maspero and the idea of deceleration from the airport into Paris, because he's doing this kind of everyday survey. And it was very interesting, I think, just from both Charles and my point of view, as both people who really do not work on the hexagon at all. You know, Charles is involved in the Caribbean, I'm involved in the Middle East, to try and focus our thinking on you know, the five-sided state of France was quite challenging and quite interesting. And thinking about things like the transnational border edges of solidarities across the border. What happens when you try to, and they've now legislated for it, have fraternité across the border, you know, as a transnational principle, not just a Republican one. So yeah, it is, and we're on our way, by the way.
Excellent. Yeah, brilliant. Rory, I see you've unmuted.
Is Catherine there? I need some help. Hiding.
Well, it sounds like you're starting.
I could say something. Yeah, I really like what Ben said, actually, about the transnational being a precursor to the nation here. And that's particularly the case with this volume, where interestingly, Spain is so deep. It is there, but it's radically decentered. It's not even the kind of point of anchorage from which we then kind of build. It's not something from which we subtract, or or to which we augment a broader transnational vision. Spain is sort of marginal from the word go. So we have 2 or 3 pieces focused on Spain, Spanish literature, Spanish music explicitly, but they link the emergence of Spanishness actually from the word go to transatlantic commerce, to the circulation of publications, to the emergence of the idea of Hispanism, of Hispania, Spanish identity in colonial Peru. Spanishness in music, for example, emerges right at the most fragile borders of geographically, culturally, linguistically of Spain. So we have a chapter on flamenco, which is about these, the inherent hybridity of the border. So it's quite interesting that just looking at our table of contents, actually, how almost spectral Spain as an entity is. And so, I mean, thanks to Catherine, who's got this amazing memory, and she can sum up these kind of tectonic plate movements in the history of empires with this amazing dexterity. We were thinking, actually, she's got this brilliant introduction to the different empires out of which this thing called Spanish as a language emerges long before anything we recognize as the nation Spain comes into being. So we have the transnational is precursor to the nation, and it takes root in this very deep trans-imperial set of histories, mobile histories of whose plate movements are constantly in friction. And then so language is obviously a good place to start, because it's the only thread that connects these 26. I mean, there are people who debate whether there are 26 or 22 or 25 Spanish-speaking countries. And of course, as you follow each of these, national linguistic or cultural or musical traditions, you come immediately into contact with other languages, with Hebrew, with Arabic, with indigenous languages, and with the frictions, with the creoles and so on that emerge at those interstices. So we have a really interesting chapter on the different creoles. There aren't actually very many in Spanish. It's not like French, which creolizes. I think that's right. I think we have relatively few in Spanish. So we have papiamento, we have palenquero, which is only spoken in the north of Colombia. Chabacano. Is this right, Catherine? Chabacano's Philippines?
I'm only going by, can you hear me? I'm only going by what Chris wrote in his in his chapter.
Yeah.
But yes.
Philippines, I think. And then, of course, Spanglish. So the United States is about to become the largest Spanish-speaking population in terms of a nation state in the world. So we sort of try thinking about this thing. Is it Hispanic? Well, no, because Hispania is a Roman imperial entity. Is it Spanish? Well, maybe it's not Spanish American. And there are so many different theorists or writers about the Spanish-speaking world have come up with this problem. Do you call it, in the Americas, which is where I work, is it Judeo, Arabo, Maya, Quiche, America? What is America in the first place? Latin is no more over there than the America bit. They're both these fragile these imports. And so there's a sort of entropy, actually, once you scratch beneath the surface of this, very short-lived 19th century idea, which in the case of Spain came belatedly because the Spaniards wanted to keep up with the Germans. You had these ideas about, Spain being a great place to go out on the beach and put your and recapture these romantic traditions and so on. So the nation is very, very, very fragile. And in Spanish or Latin American studies, we don't, I'm too young to know this really, but we don't really work within this sort of, what was the term you used? Nation-centric or
methodological nationalism.
Yeah, methodological nationalism it definitely is a spectre that we're forever trying to conjure away. But we tend to work in a transnational way anyway. If you're teaching.
Catherine, do you want to add anything to that? And I'll move on to Hilary. I'm conscious of time so that we can really have also some questions from the audience. But
no, I totally agree with Rory. I just wanted to add, actually, thank you to Rachel for her reading. That's really helpful for us. And you noted right from the start the emphasis on language, which is where our expertise is, and it doesn't matter where, which geographical part of the world, but it's the language where our expertise is, and it's the language that brings all these disparate areas together. I just found that really interesting to see the breadth. I think you asked about how to use the books for students. I do think it's important for students to get an overview of the whole development of the language before they hone in on their particular interests. And Rachel also asked us, was there anything that we thought wasn't in that we thought might have been in? Well, you know what it's like trying to put an edited volume together. And you approach people and they can't do it, and they do it, and they don't know what you expect, and so on and so forth. But all our contributors we approached and produced what we hoped they produced. I'm really, really grateful to the contributors. They were fantastic. But there was one topic, if you like, that I wanted to originally to bring in, which in the end we didn't have enough space, and that was about North African cultures in Spain today. It would have linked back to the Arabic of the earlier period. We couldn't quite pull that off. Obviously, there's no space for everything that you could do. But also, Rachel asked about the 4 sections. They were the decision of the series editors, which I think were very, very apt. And I don't know if Loridana and Derek have actually explained why those 4 sections, but that was all the books in the series have those sections, and it's what brings them together. It really focuses attention on these particular themes. So yeah, so thank you, Rachel, and thank you all the contributors, and thank you, Rory.
Thank you, Catherine.
Oh, thank you, Rory.
She's amazing. She's like this Swiss Army knife that can do everything.
Right. Well, I'll ask Hilary and Claire to say a few words, if I may. But we may come back to the question of the sections in a second. But most of all, yes, all our editors, we are all still speaking to each other, and that, I think, is an achievement in itself. So, Hilary and Claire, sorry.
Yes. Can you hear me? Okay. Yep. Well, when I was first asked to do this by Charles, obviously, if you talk about sort of national languages, often what we kind of subconsciously mean is something like a national hierarchy of languages. And I identify a lot with what Connor said about Russian, feeling that sometimes you're a little bit of an outlier. And what I thought Charles was going to ask me to do, and I dreaded this, was provide a Portuguese chapter for the Spanish volume. And I should have known better that this was definitely not where he was going with it. And that was a great relief and a great pleasure to realise that Claire and I were going to be given a book of our own. And I've often thought we could have written a second one really as well. That there is a huge amount to say about Lusophone space, Lusophone spaces. And obviously it's also been a great pleasure to connect and to cross-reference with the Spanish volume. But I think it's been very, very productive for both to allow sufficient space for 2 full transnational volumes on both of those languages. Portuguese often comes at this from a rather contradictory place because we are, Portugal is Europe's oldest nation state, but it is one of the latecomers to the family of modern languages that we teach. So in a sense, we have perhaps not had a very strong embedded sense of the national in what we do, in the sense that Portugal and Brazil have been a part of it for a very long time. There's always been Portugal, there's always been Brazilian teaching for quite a long time. So there's a twin root system to the language teaching that we do, increasingly so. And I tried quite hard to bring this out in the volume, that even when we are talking about the given that is language, it isn't actually a straightforward Eurocentric European given either, that textbooks Ponte de Encontro is the leading Brazilian. And of course, as everybody has pointed out, you're talking about many different language interactions, language hybridizations, creoles, connections with native languages across the whole spectrum of where Portuguese is found. We also wanted, I think, to deconstruct the notion of lusophonia, this idea of a lusophone space, which probably in Portugal nobody would dispute how many countries it involves, because the Comunidade de Países de Língua Portuguesa is a very well-established concept based on language. The community of those countries that have Portuguese language is arguably a very potentially Eurocentric European notion of what Portuguese language space is. So we felt we wanted to countermap that, to work against that, to use the transnationalism methodology to undo quite a lot of the existing concepts about Portugal as maritime expansion, as foundational, all been in many others of empire as defining what nationhood is, particularly during the dictatorship in the 20th century. So we felt that the transnational was an important counterforce really to looking at fixed notions like worlding, like foundational discourses of the expansion, the maritime expansion, looking at globalization, looking at lusophonia. So our first chapter sort of starts off in quite a traditional way with Zoltan Biederman, what you might think is going to be a traditional way, with Zoltan Biederman's history chapter on the maritime expansion in Asia. And what he proceeds brilliantly to do, I think, for our reader, is to undo almost all of the terminologies, all of the certainties, all of the conceptual tools that you work with, and point out the histories behind them, the complexities behind them. So your whole working lexicon for talking about that time and that period is problematized and undone from the beginning, so that you don't know what you thought you knew about things that get called the discoveries or the maritime expansion or Portuguese throughout the world. So we felt that was very important. Also talking about multiple hubs of empire, a centrifugal and a centripetal empire at different points, multiple hubs which change, which displace one another, which interact. There is no one very clear centre to empire. Most of our chapters look at least one, they look across borders, they don't work regionally, they don't deconstruct only one nation. We felt that we wanted to look at methodological nationalism as potentially as much a Brazilian issue as it is a Portuguese issue. There are methodological nationalisms to undo and to unpick in Brazil too. There's a wonderful chapter about a Lebanese migrant writing and producing photo books in Brazil, and that's an important chapter on the temporalities of transnationalism and the different temporalities contained in his photo book. So all of our chapters work across borders in some way or another, transculturally, translingually, movements of peoples, political movements, as Anna very kindly mentioned. I think quite a strong sense in which Portugal's developments of political movements, particularly in the 20th century, is a transnational experience. One of the things we did, I think, a little bit differently from most of the other volumes is we didn't put language first. I think almost everybody else has put the language section first. I deliberately decided not to do that because I felt it would set us up better to talk about it in the second section, and we would be able to displace it and deauthorize that kind of lusophonia better if we began with concepts like space and working on that Portuguese spreading around space and how you could talk differently about the maritime expansion and the discoveries. So we begin with space and move on to language.
I think that is a brilliant example, I think, of how, again, each volume has interpreted things in a different way. Precisely, it was more useful.
Yes, and I think I'll now move on to Claire. I think Claire wants to say something about how we came to our deliberate choice not to be too iconic with the cover.
Yes, that cover, Claire.
Yes. Well, I'd like to thank our contributors. I'd like to thank Hilary for being an excellent colleague and co-editor. And I'd like to thank those of our contributors who are with us today. Susanna, Ellen, Anna, and Vivian. I saw your names at the very beginning. It's great that you're here with us for this event. And yeah, how can you find, we've been talking about pluralism, we've been talking about diversity. So then how do you...
Whoops, you've muted yourself.
Sorry. How do you then find an image which can represent all that plurality? And some of the colleagues have chosen a sort of a fragmented cubist modernist painting, or street scenes showing showing many people, shop fronts, various different images. But Hilary and I discussed this quite a lot. We decided we didn't want to go for the cliches, as in our chapters. We wanted to avoid the cliches often associated with the Portuguese-speaking world. So no maps, no ships, no pictures of famous figures. So we went, in fact, to our own photos. And this is something I always tell the students, or those considering Portuguese, is that the Portuguese went around the world. They are an inherently transnational group, and so if you study Portuguese, you can go around the world and hear Portuguese being spoken. And Hilary and I have had the chance to go to. We've been together to conferences in Macau and Goa, as well as Portugal and Brazil. I found a photo, we decided in the end on a photo that I took in Macau in 2007. Now, Macau became a Portuguese territory in 1557, and an important trading post and a mélange of multiple cultures, officially handed back to the Chinese in 1999. And while we were there, we looked around the tourist sites, we walked around quite a lot and looked out for signs of cultural overlap. So, for example, I took photos of shelves full of the famous Barcelos cockerel, priced in Hong Kong dollars and captioned in Chinese characters, or trilingual menus and streets and street signs and street names. And then the image that we chose, which I don't know if Naomi could pull up for us, or I can hold up a kind of low-tech version of it. It's this archway, a doorway, Thank you very much. Thank you. It's so it's this gateway leading to a doorway and a window on the far wall of a small alley, and we thought that it combined a lot of the things that we were trying to emphasize. So there are mopeds there. There's the outline of a shrine just visible against the right hand wall. There are incense spirals hanging from metal beams, bright green moss, an intricate shutter, crisscrossing wires and graffitied bricks you can see. Then the name of the alley is printed in typically blue, Portuguese blue on white tiles or azulejos, and it's called Beco da Felicidade, which is translated into characters. And in English, it can be rendered Happiness Alley. And visitors to Macau may be aware that it's of this name. Beco da Felicidade comes off the Rua da Felicidade, Happiness Street, and it used to be the red light district, but it's reinvented itself as the gastronomic street, full of restaurants and tourist shops. So as the cover of our book, it represents a kind of portal, gateway into another colourful, somewhat chaotic, multicultural, multilingual space whose uses have changed over time. And I suppose we hope that the readers will be enticed to open the cover, ent in, and maybe find happiness.
Thank you so much for that. At this point, Naomi, I have to hand back over to you, and you have to tell us what we are to do, because we are almost at 5 o'clock, but I don't know if we can exceed by a few minutes and go over a few questions, or what you're the mistress of the house now.
I think if everyone's happy to, we can take hopefully 15 to 20 minutes just to kind of get to some of the questions that people have asked. So I've got a list of people who've asked questions who I'll kind of go through, but maybe just to start off with a very practical question, because I think everyone will want to know this, is about buying the book. So someone has asked, when will the handbook be available as an ebook? And they tried to get the other language volumes, but currently only the Russian volume was available as an ebook. And obviously they're emphasizing ebooks are very important at this current moment.
Yeah. Okay, I'll let Jenny and Derek answer on the handbook. On the other volumes, they have just gone into print. So the Spanish and Portuguese have gone into print in June. The German and the Italian have gone into print sort of now. I actually do have a copy of the Italian here that you can probably see. So it does exist. It physically exists. They're going to be available in paperback at $29.95, and there will be an e-edition for all of the volumes, but those volumes will be available as a bundle. So I don't know the exact price yet, but we've agreed with Liverpool University Press that they can be bought as a bundle, and therefore there should be a reduced price for the e-books as well. Do you know more about do you want to say more about a handbook or a handbook, Derek?
Yeah, just very quickly, the handbook, a handbook should be out next this time next year, but will also be available open access on the LUP website, which is a very important innovation. And I think we're hoping that some of the essays will be published on the LUP website in advance of the actual publication date.
Okay, so I think it's quite an important one, because I think a lot of people unfortunately do have to go. So it's good to get the kind of practical question there as well for people who do want to purchase. So yeah, I think some of the editors, I think Catherine and Rory, have got to dash off at some point. But I'll just ask, there were a few questions came in. I think actually a lot of the questions some are for the series editors and some are for the Italian volume as well. The first person, I'll do it in order of the people who kind of contacted me. So the first one is, just make sure they're still on the call, Monica Boria, if she wants to unmute and ask her question. Is she there? Great. Yeah, if you want to go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Congratulations, everybody. I posted my question in the end, but basically I was sort of intrigued by the fact that I think all the contributors to the Italian studies, the transnational Italian studies, are all sort of Anglo-American researchers or Italian in Italy or in some English-speaking country. And I just wondered whether it was a deliberate decision, whether it wasn't possible to include, other kind of transnational identities, as it were, or researchers, Italianists, not based in English-speaking countries.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a degree to which the whole series, to a degree, is born of a sense of modern languages in the UK and elsewhere, needing to talk about what, how and why one would approach, say, Italian studies in the context in which we work. And that, I think, led to a focus on how people teach and think about their work within the UK and Australia, the United States. I think so that's true, and the fact that the book is in English, and that's and it's concentrating throughout by attempting to refer to a much wider bodies of scholarship. I don't know if Loridana, you want to add to that?
I need to say, strictly speaking, and I know she is on this call, again, a huge thanks to all of our contributors for that volume. They've been immensely patient. They have produced fantastic work, and a lot of them are on this call. And strictly speaking, Monica Jansen is based in Belgium, and well, between Belgium and Holland. So strictly speaking. But it's true that there is a prevalence of, and I think it's about a certain mode of Italian studies in a sense more than anything else. I don't think it was intentional. It's probably a reflection also of our connections and connectivity in terms of our own networks. But we did intentionally go as far as we could in that world. So it's also, I think, in the case of the Italian volume, partly a reflection of the fact that we've been working on the Transnationalizing Modern Languages, which was an Italian-focused project, and that project that one did look intentionally at mostly an Anglophone world with also Hispanic elements, especially thanks to Naomi, who's here, and to Margaret Hills-Zerati. So there's no way, as we keep saying, all of us keep thinking that there are things that we've left out, and there may be more things that we could have put in. But the reflection is probably also that of the way in which we built our own networks. But Monica's in Belgium. I have to say that, or she would be telling me off later.
Yes, I forgot about that. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your answers.
Thanks. I think we've got another question. It is partly about the Italian, but I think actually it can apply to all of the volumes about translation. Riccardo, are you able to unmute yourself? Did you want to ask Riccardo Raimondo?
Yeah, I don't know if I did it. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear.
Maybe, can you see me? I don't know. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, my congratulations for this thrilling and exciting project. Well, I have a question. I think it's a question very common about among postdoctoral researchers, with a view to applying or to applying for a position or to submitting an article. How can we consider the traditional translation studies from the point of view of translational studies? Well, I will give an example. For instance, if I'm studying English translations of Dante, do I have to consider myself in the field of translational Italian studies or in the field of English translational English studies? Well, can you understand my concern? It's very complicated to situate our profile, our academic profile, with a view to applying for positions or, you know, submitting articles or whatever. So I would really like to have a suggestion from you, or, well, any commentaries are welcome. Thank you.
Rory, go ahead.
It's just a flippant remark. I completely understand this, but maybe what we're trying to do with this is think about how you can be a bit more. Once we have all these fields out there, but you can play with them. I think it was Max Weber once said. Someone said, "What field are you in?" And he said, "I'm not a donkey."
But look, let's if you want, let's split. Yeah.
We're all donkeys trying to get out of a set of fields. These are kind of Borgesian constructs that we then kind of get walled into. And I think the spirit of the exercise is one of exploration. And we said in our volume, you know, explore, try other angles. You know, imagine yourself as a reader of Dante in, I don't know, in Ljubljana or in Patagonia, and that's where the magic happens, isn't it? But I suppose when you're a postdoc and you're trying to find a place in this very daunting sort of the politics of different fields and so on, you have to say where you're coming from, don't you? But maybe some of the discussions in these volumes will allow you to take those positionings more lightly.
Look, all I would say is that the donkeys are a very good image in the sense that you have to be stubborn. This is spoken as someone who had, you know, spent a very long time in, you know, formally in the field of Italian studies while doing translation studies. I am currently professor of translation studies while doing Italian studies, and I'm just about to move to a position in Italian American studies, where I will continue to do Italian studies, translation studies, and Italian American studies, and whatever else. So stubbornness comes into it.
Yeah.
And also the ambition of the series is very much to think of modern languages de facto transnational studies, rather than to be thinking in national silos, which is a problem and has been a problem for modern languages for quite some while.
Thank you.
Right. I think Serena Bassi had, I think maybe the question's already been answered because it was about also the national and transnational, but Serena, did you want to follow up?
I have a completely different question from the one that I initially posed to you, if that's okay. And it kind of ties back to both the really interesting point that Hilary and Claire made about their choice to not start with language, but start with space. And also, also responding to Riccardo's point of how does that kind of, I'm also an early career researcher, and how does all of this kind of, perhaps also one of the reasons why it was very exciting as an early career researcher to contribute to the volume in the Italian volume, was because it seemed like an opportunity to actually affect a structural change, something that might also eventually lead to different hiring practices that look at the national a little bit differently, and therefore make room for different kinds of scholarship also at the junior levels. So what I want to hear from the series editors a little bit more about was really the tension between area studies and modern languages. So who gets to be politically, who gets to be a language, and who gets to be an area? And so, especially when you go on to plan the Arabic studies volume, perhaps in the future we'll see a transnational Welsh studies volume or a transnational Catalan studies volume, and how does that all kind of speak to the political tension between an area and a language? Like Italian is clearly a language because Italian has Dante. Italian is a literary tradition, whereas
as Carlyle said, yes.
Right, and whereas certain places get cast as areas, and so yeah, if you just wanted to kind of, I would love to hear your ideas in any order about that.
Yeah, absolutely, Serena. I think there is a question as to what we were very keen on saying, that this is a series of texts that are intimately connected with one another, that they're evolving and changing and hopefully expanding, and that as they do that, they're expanding the series of questions that we ask and the resources that, above all, students have to ask those questions. We certainly don't want to think of ourselves in competition with different ways of doing modern languages, inflections of the terms, or indeed its relationship with area studies. And I think one way of answering that question is to think about how seamlessly translating cultures from which many initiatives of this kind were born, how they moved into the Open World Research Initiative, which does have, in some of its projects, a very clear area studies focus. So I think in some ways there is a question of dialogue, connection, interconnectivity that is very important, rather than necessarily thinking about divides between an area study and a language study. I think we would interpret the two as fluid and in constant movement, and a movement that is very beneficial to both. And I think especially important for early career researchers.
Can I come in there just in response to Serena's anticipation of the series in the future? I think it's important to say that we don't really see the future necessarily being articulated in national, transnational terms. The volumes that we've been thinking about look, for example, we've been talking to people about, for example, transnational digital humanities, transnational environmental humanities, transnational Black studies. And I think this is very much the next step, really, to in the project to dismantle the nation within modern languages. So the transnational approach, actually, the methodology that Charles and other people have been talking about, actually leaves the language or the area dimension sort of behind, and takes us into allows us to make different disciplinary connections. And I think that's where the series will go in future, which is not to exclude, the transnational Welsh, the transnational Scottish studies, or whatever, if it's an interesting project. But we don't really perceive the future as being national.
Yeah. If I can add just one tiny thing to that, it's, well, not tiny, short, but not tiny, is that in a sense, the reason for starting with those established, in a way, you could even say traditional fields within modern languages, was precisely that there was this sense that you needed to, so many of the people who've spoken, so many of the editors have said this, you needed to sort of dismantle them from the inside. You needed to put these images out there to then say, look, you may be thinking you're looking at the most German of things here, but actually it already can, we can unpick even that. You may be thinking you're looking at an established notion of what is Lusophone, but actually every single, as Hilary said, every single instrument that we pick up can be unmade. So there was an intentionality in that, to take those traditional fields and open them up from the inside. But now we can also precisely move in different directions, as Derek was saying. And by the way, just to pick up something that Donna just said, yes, I forgot. Donna, of course, is also in Canada. And Canada is another place which is not strictly Anglophone now in terms of the areas that we were covering in Italian.
So I think that Donna did ask in the questions, but I think people have responded to that. I don't know if you wanted to say any more about the kind of movement beyond to other scripts and other languages, but you have kind of, I think, maybe covered that in your response there. But I think that's probably, unless there was anything else editors or anyone else wanted to come in on in the comments. I think, as you'll see, there's a lot of comments saying they're really looking forward to the volume. So I was just finding the questions in amongst those. But I think people, a lot of congratulations for the series and pulling this together. So yeah, I think that's all of the questions I had noted down. But if there's any final points any of the editors wanted to come in on.
Only really a massive thank you for the quality of the discussion and the engagement from everyone.
And a thank again to the IMLR for hosting this and for being so generous with the time, and to everybody who's stayed for the course and asked questions, and to especially Anna and Claire and Kumbola and Rachel for agreeing to be well, not guinea pigs, but definitely our test readers.
Well, thanks to all of the speakers, and thanks for letting the IMLR host this event. It has been a really interesting discussion and goes to so much of what the IMLR is and should be doing. And so, yeah, thanks to the editors, thanks to all of the panelists, and thanks for all of the questions. And I think we can, say goodbye there. Thanks very much.